Christianity, which today is embraced by nearly 2.5 billion people, did not appear in its earliest years as a belief system destined to become so vast. In fact, the number of people carrying it barely reached a few hundred. In the strict political atmosphere of the Roman Empire, amid internal tensions within the Jewish community, and during a time when new ideas were not easily welcomed, no one could have imagined that such a small group would one day change the course of history. Everything began with a long accumulated expectation within the Jewish people living under Roman rule. The expectation of the Messiah, centuries of hardship, occupations, economic pressures, and living under the shadow of great empires, had left a deep longing for the day when God would send a deliverer. This deliverer, descended from David, would restore Israel to its former strength and establish God's kingdom on earth. This idea held a powerful place in the minds of everyone living in that era. It was in this environment that the son of a carpenter from Nazareth appeared, Jesus. The teachings of Jesus did not give the impression that he was trying to establish a new religion. On the contrary, it was a call that complemented the existing Jewish faith and gave it a new depth. Jesus proclaimed that the coming Messiah would restore God's justice, defeat evil, reward the righteous, and bring forth a new order in the world. When this message merged with the deep-rooted expectation of the Messiah in Jewish society, it became even more compelling. The first people who gathered around Jesus were not a crowd that had abandoned religious rituals. They were still Jews living on Jewish land, loyal to Jewish traditions. They attended synagogue, kept Jewish laws, but interpreted these laws with the new meanings Jesus brought. For this reason, this group was not initially seen as followers of a different religion. They appeared more like a reform movement within Judaism. As Jesus' teaching spread, a critical question emerged. If this man was truly sent by God, then why was he crucified? Why was he treated as a criminal by Rome? And why would God allow his promised deliverer to die in such a way? At this point, the followers of Jesus did not see his death as a defeat. On the contrary, they interpreted it as the fulfillment of his role. According to them, Jesus had risen again, appeared to his followers, and shown that his message would continue. These claims, in an era when Rome ruled the Jewish people with a heavy hand, were naturally met with skepticism. Yet for the first community, these experiences strengthened their faith and set them in motion. Those closest to Jesus would later be known as the Apostles. They believed they were responsible not only for sharing his message with the Jewish people, but also with the entire world. Their efforts laid the foundation for a movement that began in small houses in Jerusalem, grew through simple gatherings around humble tables, and gradually spread from city to city. The earliest Christian communities were nothing like the church buildings we know today. Their meetings were simple gatherings in the homes of wealthier believers. These homes began to be called ecclesia, meaning the assembly. The first hint of the modern church emerged from these modest house gatherings. In the early years, the community consisted solely of Jews. These people still considered themselves Jewish. They simply believed that the teachings of Jesus were the completion of truth. But there was a problem. Jews represented only a small fraction of the population in the Roman Empire. Therefore, if the message was going to reach broader groups, it had to appeal to the rest of society, namely the pagans. But was this possible? Could a Jewish teaching open itself to non-Jews? Could God's message be argued to be universal? These questions sparked one of the biggest debates within the first community. At first, the apostles preached only to Jews because Judaism had always had clear boundaries: ethnic, cultural, and ritual. But over time, people from different cultures began to be influenced by this new teaching. Some wanted to embrace the faith without becoming Jewish. This is where the real turning point appeared. Most of the people throughout the Roman Empire were city-dwelling pagans who were not unfamiliar with the concept of gods or divine truth. Among these people, the new movement began to spread rapidly, but this expansion lit the fuse of new internal disagreements. Would these non-Jewish believers obey Jewish laws? For example, would circumcision be required? Would they have to follow Jewish dietary rules? The debates surrounding these questions grew into a major communal crisis. Eventually, a meeting was held in Jerusalem. This meeting would later be known as the Council of Jerusalem. The decision made there shaped the future of the new faith. Non-Jews would not be required to follow Jewish law. Only certain ethical principles would remain, but the ritual demands of Judaism would not be obligatory. This decision marked the first major step toward Christianity becoming independent from Judaism. The movement had now crossed beyond a single ethnic group. The idea of one God, moral reform, and the belief in the Messiah had gained a framework capable of transcending nations. From this point on, the community began to move step by step toward becoming a religion. But the journey had only begun. A new era awaited them, an era that would carry the message not only throughout Jerusalem, but all the way to the heart of Rome. And in the midst of all these developments, a figure was slowly stepping onto the stage, one who would change the destiny of this movement. As the first community in Jerusalem slowly grew stronger, a question hung constantly in the air. Was this new teaching meant to remain within the boundaries of the Jewish people? Or was it a message that could reach people living all across the world? The answer to this question began to clarify with the start of what would later be called the Apostolic Age. The closest followers of Jesus, the apostles, had become the leaders of the first community established in Jerusalem. One of them, Peter, was seen as the natural leader. He had spent more time with Jesus than most, and according to tradition, he was the backbone of the early community in Jerusalem. At first, the apostles did not travel far from Jerusalem. The roots of the new faith were still deeply embedded within Jewish society. In their eyes, the message of Jesus was a continuation of Jewish history. Therefore, the best place to speak about him was Jerusalem and its surrounding regions. However, over time, both political and social factors began pushing them outward. In the early years, the community was relatively quiet, but as the movement grew, some leaders in Jerusalem began to see this new group as a threat. Certain religious authorities interpreted Jesus' teaching as a misguided idea, and they feared Rome might mistake this movement for another Jewish uprising. Jerusalem was already a fragile city. A small spark could easily turn into a large revolt. In this environment, some apostles and early leaders began traveling between regions. Some went toward Samaria, others to the Phoenician cities to the north, and some even moved into the interior of Asia Minor. Yet these journeys were limited, compared to the transformation that would soon be set in motion by one man. That man was known by his Hebrew name Saul, but history would remember him by another name, Paul. Paul began at the opposite end of the movement. He came from a devout Jewish family, was well educated, and was deeply knowledgeable about Jewish law. During the early days of the Christian movement, this new teaching appeared to him as a dangerous deviation that might corrupt Judaism. Because of this, Paul was known as someone who worked to prevent the spread of Christian communities in and around Jerusalem. But then, Paul experienced a profound turning point in his life. According to the accounts, he was on the road to Damascus when he saw a blinding light and collapsed. Paul described this moment as one that opened his eyes while they were closed. For him, this encounter was an awakening to the truth of the new faith. His vision was impaired for a while, and was restored only after a prayer from a member of the new community. This event completely transformed Paul. A man who had once opposed the movement suddenly became one of its strongest defenders. But what truly set him apart was not just his belief. It was his knowledge of the Roman world. He understood its roads, cities, cultures, and languages. This familiarity made him uniquely positioned to spread the new faith. The first thing Paul did was travel to Jerusalem to meet the leaders. Naturally, there were reservations. The man who had tried to destroy the community was now among them. Distrust was inevitable. But over time, it became clear that Paul's intentions were sincere. From that point on, Paul embarked on long journeys. These travels, later regarded as foundational pillars of Christian history, led to the establishment of new communities across the Roman Empire. In every city he visited, Paul first went to the synagogue to speak to the Jews, then reached out to the pagans. These cities included small towns in Asia Minor, Greek city-states, the Aegean coasts, Macedonia, and many other centers of the Roman world. One of the most remarkable aspects of Paul's work was his habit of writing letters to the communities he left behind. These letters offered solutions to their problems, clarified teachings, and provided encouragement. Today, a significant portion of the New Testament consists of these letters. Paul's teachings deeply shaped the movement. His insistence that non-Jews could also be part of the faith was a defining element in Christianity's transformation from a branch of Judaism into a universal religion. The movement was no longer a small religious interpretation confined to the Jewish people. People from different nations, languages, and cultures were joining the community, and the teaching was crossing borders. But this expansion also created new tensions. The community in Jerusalem still adhered more closely to Jewish traditions. Paul's communities, however, consisted of people from diverse cultures and had a more flexible structure. This occasionally led to disagreements, especially around issues like circumcision, dietary laws, and ritual purity. Despite these tensions, Paul's influence helped the movement become a visible force in the Roman world. Christianity was no longer limited to small house meetings. Communities began to appear in Asia Minor, Greece, Alexandria, and even within Rome itself. This growing presence inevitably drew the attention of the Roman authorities. At first, the Roman Empire did not pay much attention to Christians. They were seen as a subgroup of Judaism. But as the movement grew and became more visible in the cities, it started to appear, at least to Rome, as a potential issue. Paul's own story ended in Rome. According to tradition, he was arrested, taken to the city, and executed there. But even in death, the communities he left behind had become unshakably strong. Through Paul's efforts, Christianity had become a faith system that traveled from city to city, connecting roads, ports, and cultures. But growth had a natural consequence. Rome was now fully aware of the movement, and nothing that drew Rome's attention remained untouched for long. Now the stage was shifting toward a new era in which the Roman Empire's stance toward Christians would grow increasingly harsh, affecting the entire empire in the process. As Paul's travels helped the movement spread across the Roman world, the new community was no longer just a group of small house gatherings. It was beginning to attract attention, becoming woven into the social fabric of cities, and in some places, presenting a way of life unfamiliar to the public. There was an inevitable consequence to this. The Roman Empire would eventually turn and look directly at this movement. And whenever Rome paid attention to something, history entered a new phase. At first, Rome did not apply a systematic policy against Christians. They were seen as a subgroup of the Jewish community. What mattered to Rome was that order remained intact and that people showed loyalty to the imperial cult. Religious freedom in Rome was considerable. People could worship their own gods and continue their local rituals. But there was a limit. Loyalty to the imperial authority had to be demonstrated. The Christians' problems began exactly at this point. This new community refused to participate in the imperial cult, which was considered a political act of loyalty to the state. In their belief system, there was only one God, and no one else could be given divine attributes. To Rome, this stance appeared not just as a religious difference, but as a political threat. The first major conflict erupted during the reign of Emperor Nero. In 64 AD, a massive fire consumed much of Rome. Flames raged for days, swallowing wooden structures and leaving thousands homeless. The true cause of the fire was never confirmed, but rumors quickly spread that Nero had burned the city to carry out his own reconstruction plans. He needed someone to blame. He needed a target. And his eyes turned to a small defenseless religious group, the Christians. The persecutions under Nero mostly targeted the small Christian community in the city of Rome. They were not systematic, nor were they part of a policy implemented throughout the empire. Yet this period held enormous symbolic significance in history, because Nero's actions strengthened the growing association between Christians and disloyalty to the state. According to the narratives of the time, Christians were thrown to wild animals in arenas, subjected to torture, and turned into a public object of fear and hatred. Small communities retreated underground, gathering in burial grounds and catacombs. These scenes would later become iconic symbols of persecution in Christian art. But one thing must be noted clearly. Even this period of persecution did not stop the growth of Christianity. On the contrary, their endurance in the face of suffering sparked curiosity among the public. The communities continued to grow quietly. The emperors who succeeded Nero took varying approaches to Christians. Some ignored them completely, some left the matter to local governors, and some applied limited pressure. This created different experiences for communities depending on where they lived. But by the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was shaken by massive crises. Economic collapse, civil wars, border invasions, political instability. In this atmosphere of chaos, Rome began to search for a scapegoat. And once again, that scapegoat became the Christians. When Emperor Decius came to power in 249, he sought to restore unity within the empire. He believed Rome's misfortunes stemmed from abandoning the old Roman gods. So he issued a decree requiring all citizens of the empire to offer sacrifices to the Roman deities. This was less a matter of belief and more a ritual expression of loyalty to the state. But the Christians would not obey this order. Their monotheistic belief made it impossible for them to participate in any ritual involving idols. This transformed them, in the eyes of Rome, into dangerous separatists. The Decian period is known as the first empire-wide persecution against Christians' arrests, confiscation of property, torture, and in some regions, executions occurred. Decius died shortly after, but he left behind something far more influential. The idea within Rome that Christianity was not merely a different belief, but a potential threat to the state. Not long after, during the reign of Emperor Valerian, pressures increased again. This time, religious leaders were specifically targeted. Eliminating community leaders was seen as a strategy to dismantle the movement. Some bishops were exiled, others executed. Yet every act of repression only strengthened the internal bonds of the movement. One of the most difficult periods in Christian history began in 303 AD. Under Emperor Diocletian, the Great Persecution aimed at completely erasing the movement. Churches were destroyed, sacred texts burned, leaders targeted, and gatherings banned. Rome intended to pull Christianity out by the roots, but there was one thing Diocletian could not foresee. Such intense pressure did not eradicate the movement. Instead, it made it more resilient and more visible. Communities withdrew underground but never disappeared. People were willing to pay heavy prices for their faith, and the public watched. This courage increased the respect and curiosity toward Christians. Ironically, the more the empire tried to crush them, the more Christianity grew. Persecution produced not fear, but intrigue and admiration. Many people began asking, "Why are these people so steadfast?" And in the midst of all this repression, developments that would change the course of history were slowly forming. The Roman Empire was on the verge of collapse, both internally and externally. Political fragmentation, economic disasters, and military pressure shook the empire. This chaos laid the groundwork for the rise of a new leader. At this moment, someone was about to step onto the stage, a man whose name would be written at one of the greatest turning points in history. His era would open the door to both the greatest resurgence of Christianity and a structural transformation of the empire itself. The crisis the Roman Empire fell into toward the end of the 3rd century was not merely a political collapse. Civil wars, economic breakdowns, plagues, pressure along the borders. The empire was on the brink of falling apart. Each region produced its own commander. Armies turned on one another, and Rome became nearly impossible to govern from a single center. It was during such a turbulent time that a figure emerged who would transform the empire not only politically but religiously as well. Constantine. Constantine's rise to power took place during one of Rome's most chaotic periods. Different regions of the empire were ruled separately, and in each region another general claimed to be the true emperor. Through military strength and political intelligence, Constantine became one of the strongest contenders in this struggle. But what makes Constantine's story one of the most debated episodes in history is the vision he reportedly experienced before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. According to various accounts, Constantine saw a sign in the sky on the eve of the battle. Some sources describe it as a light, others as a symbol resembling a cross, and some mention words meaning, "In this sign you will conquer." Historians still debate the details, but one thing is certain. After this event, Constantine's attitude toward Christians changed dramatically. His victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 made him the dominant leader of the Western Roman Empire. The following year, in 313, one of the most significant documents in history was issued: the Edict of Milan. This decree prohibited the persecution of Christians within the empire and guaranteed them the freedom to worship openly. After centuries of suffering, this decision marked a turning point in Christian history. For the first time, the empire recognized them not as enemies, but as equal citizens. However, one common misconception must be corrected. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion with this edict. The empire was still polytheistic, but Christians no longer had to hide underground. Churches could be built openly, communities could gather freely, and clergy could practice without fear. Whether Constantine's interest in Christianity was purely political or also personal is still debated by scholars. But what is certain is this: Constantine took steps that strengthened the position of Christians within the Empire Church. Construction received state support. Community leaders were granted privileges within imperial administration. Certain tax exemptions were established. And perhaps most importantly, Constantine began to intervene directly in religious disputes within the movement. Because once Christianity was legalized, old wounds and unresolved debates resurfaced. People who read the same texts and claimed the same belief still held different theological interpretations. Jesus' nature, his relationship to God, how sacred texts should be understood, what teachings were authoritative. These disputes grew and began to threaten the unity of the Church. The most famous of these controversies erupted around the teachings of Arius of Alexandria. According to Arius, Jesus was not of the same essence as God. He was a being created by God. For many church leaders, this was unacceptable. They believed it weakened Jesus' divinity and undermined one of Christianity's core doctrines. The debate grew so intense that Constantine himself intervened. The empire was only just beginning to regain stability. He could not allow religious divisions to jeopardize it. Thus, in 325, one of the most important gatherings in religious history was convened, the Council of Nicaea. Hundreds of bishops from different regions came together in Nicaea. Weeks of discussions, disagreements, and long negotiations followed. In the end, a foundational statement of Christian belief was produced, the Nicene Creed. This creed affirmed that Jesus was of the same essence as God. Arius's teachings were rejected, and for the first time, the Church gained an official, unified doctrinal framework. The steps taken during Constantine's reign deeply shaped the structure and organization of the Church. The Church was no longer merely a spiritual community. It had become an institutional force within the empire. It was intertwined with imperial administration. Its economic power grew, and its political influence became increasingly visible. After Constantine's death, this process continued. Official support for Rome's old gods declined. Christianity became increasingly popular in both cities and rural areas. Churches multiplied, the number of clergy grew, and communities expanded. And in 380, about half a century after Constantine, the Edict of Thessalonica, issued by Emperor Theodosius I, declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. At that moment, the destinies of both the empire and Christianity crossed a point of no return. A small community that once prayed in catacombs and hid from imperial patrols was now seated at the center of the most powerful empire in the world. But as power grew, new debates emerged. Cultural differences between the empire's eastern and western regions deepened. Theology began to be interpreted differently, and disputes arose about where the center of the Church's authority should be. The empire was increasingly difficult to govern from a single center. And just as the political structure began drifting in two directions, the religious structure also started dividing along parallel lines. This division would lead us to the next great chapter, the long process during which the Eastern and Western churches gradually drifted apart. After the Roman Empire accepted Christianity as its official religion, the fate of the continent changed irreversibly. Pagan temples slowly emptied, ancient rituals became less common among the people, and the new religious order gained power with every passing year. Those living in Rome did not have to abandon their respect for the gods of the past immediately, but the state's support had clearly shifted toward Christianity. This shift rapidly weakened the authority of the old beliefs within society. With the laws enacted during the reign of Theodosius, tolerance toward paganism effectively came to an end. Performing sacrifices in pagan temples, offering gifts to the old gods, or holding traditional ceremonies became punishable acts. In some regions, the population willingly adapted to this new order, but in others, especially in rural areas, groups continued to secretly honor their ancient deities. Despite this resistance, the empire's overall direction was now certain. Christianity was at the center, and the state system would shape itself around this new faith. Another consequence of this religious transformation was cultural change. Some old temples were converted into churches, others were destroyed entirely, and some were simply abandoned. Many pagan statues displayed in museums today, with broken faces, missing limbs, or chipped surfaces, bear the marks of this transition. Sacred symbols, worship practices, and spaces once considered holy by the public went through a profound transformation. The multi-layered religious landscape shaped by Rome for centuries was now giving way to a more centralized order. But while such deep changes unfolded within the borders of the empire, entirely different forces were rising outside. The Huns advanced into Eastern Europe. The Goths and Vandals exerted pressure on Roman territories, and the balance of the continent began to shake. Rome struggled to manage its internal religious transformation, while also trying to defend its borders. This pressure caused severe strain, especially in the Western Roman Empire. When the West fell in 476, the political vacuum across Europe became even deeper. It was within this vacuum that a new power began to rise. The Franks, initially part of the broader Roman sphere of influence, this Germanic people gradually built strong kingdoms. The Frankish rulers adopted Christianity as a strategic tool. The new religion united their people and secured the support of the Roman Church over time. A powerful alliance formed between the Frankish kings and the papacy. One of the most dramatic moments of this alliance occurred in the year 800 in Rome, on Christmas Day. Pope Leo III placed a crown on the head of the Frankish king Charlemagne and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. This scene was the beginning of a new era in European religious and political history. The West now had its own Christian emperor, a symbolic rebirth of the old Roman legacy through the hands of the Franks. Charlemagne's coronation marked one of the high points of papal power. The very act of a king becoming emperor through the hands of the Pope strengthened the idea, in the minds of the people, that spiritual authority surpassed political authority. Yet in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, such a claim was never accepted. The Patriarch of Constantinople held great authority, but Byzantine emperors saw themselves as the ultimate decision-makers in religious matters. This approach stood in sharp contrast to the papal-centered structure in the West. These two different understandings, papal supremacy in the West and emperor-centered leadership in the East, became the foundation of a growing tension between the Eastern and Western branches of Christianity. There was still no official split, but cultural, theological, and political differences were becoming increasingly pronounced. On one side stood Latin culture, Roman law, and papal authority. On the other stood Greek culture, Byzantine traditions, and the emperor's religious leadership. Though both belonged to the same faith, the two worlds operated almost as independent civilizations. In Northern Europe, Frankish power strengthened, while in the East, Byzantium struggled with its own challenges, battling tribes along the borders while dealing with internal religious disputes. This shaped the spread of Christianity across the continent, allowing the faith to evolve differently in different regions. Thus, the process that began with Rome's Christianization was now reshaping the entire political map of Europe. The old pagan order that had once defined the ancient world was fading, replaced by a fully Christian-centered reality. Kingdoms, peoples, and empires were repositioning themselves around this new order. And this long journey was now guiding us toward the next phase of Christianity's institutional formation in Europe. The rise of the papacy and the inevitable separation between the Eastern and Western churches. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 did not only create a political vacuum in Europe, it also radically changed the distribution of religious authority. Lands shaped for centuries by Rome's order were suddenly divided into kingdoms, tribes, and warrior rulers. In this new world, there was no central authority people could rely on for stability and security. At this point, the papacy, previously seen as a purely spiritual institution, unexpectedly began transforming into a political power. For the people of Rome, the empire was now a thing of the past, but the Pope was still there. He was the only permanent authority left in the city. Even when the Ostrogoths captured Rome, They did not touch the papal institution. In fact, they often tried to use the Pope's influence to gain public support. Thus, the papacy began to be viewed as a trustworthy guide, both by the local population and by the new ruling elites. During this period, the papal office ceased to be merely a religious institution issuing spiritual decisions, and became one of the most powerful diplomatic actors in Western Europe. Popes negotiated with external powers, represented cities, and at times even acted as mediators during wars. Rome was no longer breathing under the command of an emperor, but was effectively governed by the Pope and the spiritual leaders surrounding him. Yet the rise of papal power during this era was not happening uncontested. It was being challenged by another major force, the Byzantine Empire. When Rome returned to Byzantine control during the reign of Justinian, emperors sought to fully integrate the papal office under their authority. A newly elected pope could not officially assume his position without the emperor's approval. This led to long delays and serious conflicts. Some popes waited months, even years, before they could begin their duties. This Byzantine influence severely strained the papacy's independence. But the people of Rome, especially during years of war and famine, saw that the institution offering them the most assistance was still the papacy. For this reason, Byzantine interference never managed to weaken the Pope's influence over the population. By the 8th century, however, the situation changed completely. Byzantium had grown weak due to long wars against the Arabs and other enemies. It no longer had the strength to defend its territories in Italy. This weakness became especially evident when the Lombards advanced from the north. The Lombards had grown powerful enough to threaten Rome itself. The papacy knew it could no longer rely on Byzantine support. So it turned its attention to another rising force in the west, the Franks. Frankish King Pepin was a devout ruler who wanted to build strong relations with the papacy. The Pope's approval was extremely valuable to him, because in the eyes of the people, papal endorsement meant divine legitimacy. This mutual need laid the foundation for one of the most important alliances in history. At the Pope's request, Pepin marched into Italy with his army, pushed the Lombards back, and secured Rome. But this was not the most significant action Pepin took. In 756, with a decision that would enter history, he gifted a large territory, including Ravenna and surrounding lands, to the papacy. This event, known as the Donation of Pepin, marked the moment when the papacy ceased to be solely a spiritual power and became an actual state. For the first time in European history, a pope began ruling a vast region directly. This newly formed entity would endure for centuries and came to be known as the Papal States. The papacy's political rise strengthened its ties with the Franks even further. The peak of this alliance unfolded during the reign of Pepin's son, Charlemagne. Charlemagne would become one of the most influential figures in European history, not only for his military leadership, but also for his cultural and religious initiatives. By the late 8th century, Charlemagne had unified a large portion of Europe. His kingdom was the largest seen since the Roman Empire. Coupled with papal support, his power became nearly untouchable. But the Pope's need for Charlemagne was just as great. Rome remained politically vulnerable, and the papacy needed a strong protector. On Christmas Day in the year 800, one of the most symbolic scenes in history took place. Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head in Rome and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. This was not merely a coronation ceremony, it was the rebirth of the West. From that moment on, the papacy became not only the spiritual leader of Europe, but also an authority capable of shaping political powers. Charlemagne's empire was sanctified by the papacy, while the papacy's authority was protected by Frankish arms. Thus, Europe's future began to take shape through the partnership of these two major institutions. However, This rise would eventually plant the seeds of even greater divisions between the Byzantine East and the papacy in the West. Both sides began to view their own authority as universal, and this conflict marked the beginning of the long road toward the greatest schism in Christian history. The rise of the Franks in Europe and the strengthening of papal authority shaped the Western branch of the Christian world in a unique way, while in the East, meaning Byzantium, things were moving in a completely different direction. Constantinople, with its centuries-old tradition, strong central administration, and deeply intellectual theology, saw itself as the natural center of Christianity. The emperor, as God's earthly representative, stood at the head of both political and religious authority. In the West, however, the structure was the exact opposite. Papal authority was seen as superior to that of emperors, and the person who claimed to be the universal leader of the entire church, and the one issuing religious decisions, was the Pope. These two opposing understandings formed the foundation of a tension that grew slowly over centuries. At first, this tension did not erupt into open conflict, but beneath the surface, an irreversible fracture was taking shape. At the root of the divide between East and West were not only political differences, but also profound cultural ones. The Western world spoke Latin, shaped by Roman law and Latin tradition. The East, however, lived in a completely different intellectual universe dominated by the Greek language, philosophical debate, and theological depth. Although the two sides belonged to the same religion, they lived in almost entirely different worlds. Over time, their forms of worship, liturgical structures, and even everyday religious practices began to diverge. In the East, icons, lengthy liturgies, and deep mystical traditions came to the forefront, while the West moved toward a more institutional, legal-structured, and disciplined religious approach. But the sharpest point of division was the issue of authority. The papacy claimed to be the universal leader of all Christianity, asserting that it held final authority over all bishops and all churches. Byzantium argued that this was impossible, insisting that each church was independent under its own patriarch and that the emperor was the highest authority in religious matters. This struggle, fueled by centuries of disagreement, gradually turned from small disputes into a wide chasm. Around the same time, the Filioque controversy added fuel to the fire. The Western Church added the phrase "and the Son" to the Creed, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Church argued that this was theologically incorrect, that it altered the original text, and that such a change could not be made without an ecumenical council's approval. This theological disagreement made the already fragile relations between the two sides even more strained. By the 11th century, East-West relations were nearing a breaking point. Mutual distrust, political rivalry, and disputes over religious authority had escalated to the extent that even a small spark could trigger a major conflict. And that spark came in 1054. Cardinal Humbert, sent by Pope Leo IX, traveled to Constantinople. His mission was to call the Eastern Church to submit to Rome's authority and to resolve existing disagreements. But standing opposite him was Patriarch Michael I Cerularius, a strong-willed figure. Cerularius defended the independence of the Byzantine Church and absolutely rejected the papacy's claims of supremacy. Negotiations between the two sides quickly reached an impasse. The West was unwilling to retreat, and the East had no intention of acknowledging papal dominance. When talks collapsed, Cardinal Humbert took an action that would mark one of the most dramatic moments in church history. He walked up to the holy altar of Hagia Sophia, unrolled a scroll, and placed on the altar a document excommunicating Patriarch Cerularius. This was not merely a religious decision. It was the symbolic shutting of the doors between two worlds. Cerularius responded in kind. The Byzantine side officially excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and his delegation. These mutual excommunications formalized the greatest rupture in Christian history. This event became known as the Great Schism of 1054. The Western and Eastern churches were now officially divided. West, the Roman Catholic Church. East, the Orthodox Church. This separation did not happen in a single day. It was the culmination of centuries of accumulated tension. But the year 1054 marked the moment the relationship reached a point of no return. This divide would shape not only the religious world, but also the future of Europe for centuries to come. The East and West were now not just two separate churches, but two separate political spheres, two distinct cultures, and two different civilizations. And this division would soon open the gates to a new era, one defined by the bloodiest, most chaotic, and most massive movements of the Middle Ages, the Crusades. The Great Schism of 1054 had divided the Christian world into two separate paths. Yet, this split was in no way the end of the tension. On the contrary, the developments that erupted immediately afterward made the relationship between East and West even more complicated. The greatest and most historically significant of these developments was undoubtedly the Crusades. The emergence of the Crusades was not the result of a single event, but the culmination of centuries of accumulated problems, fears, and expectations. On one hand, Europe's population was increasing, land was becoming scarce, and nobles were engaged in internal power struggles. On the other hand, the Church was searching for an opportunity to unite Western Christianity under a single purpose. To this already complex picture was added the military collapse experienced by Byzantium. By the end of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire had suffered heavy losses against the Seljuk forces in Anatolia. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 left the eastern frontiers completely defenseless. Most of Anatolia was lost in a short time. Byzantium found itself struggling even to protect its capital. At this point, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was forced to request assistance from the West. The appeal Byzantium sent to the papacy and Western rulers quickly transformed into something far beyond a simple request for military help. The papacy saw this call not merely as a chance to aid the East, but also as an extraordinary opportunity to establish religious unity and strengthen its own authority. Pope Urban II's Council of Clermont in 1095 became one of the turning points that changed the course of history. Standing before thousands of clergy and nobles gathered in the square, the Pope rose and delivered his unforgettable call. Christians must rescue the Holy Lands and reclaim Jerusalem. This was not simply a call to war, it carried a spiritual promise. The Pope declared that everyone who joined this expedition would be absolved of all sins. Hearing this, the crowd stirred. People listened to the Pope's words with tears. Individuals from every class of society, nobles, knights, peasants, began to feel themselves part of this sacred mission. For the first time in centuries, European lords who had been warring with one another were uniting around a single goal. Churches, monasteries, and courts were all shaken by this call. Thousands, who bore the sign of the cross, set off on the road. This movement would be remembered in history as the First Crusade. The Crusaders passed through Byzantine lands and entered Anatolia. Although Byzantium was not entirely pleased with the arrival of these armies, it had no choice but to guide them. Their first targets were Antalya, then central Anatolia, and eventually Antioch. After months of harsh sieges, starvation, and disease, the Crusaders captured Antioch. By 1099, the Crusader armies reached the gates of Jerusalem. After a siege lasting several months, the city fell. The capture of Jerusalem was celebrated as a great victory in Europe. Yet the massacres that took place within the city became one of the darkest chapters in history. This development transformed not only the religious world, but also the political balance. The Crusader states established in Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli reshaped the entire structure of the Middle East. For the first time, Western power extended this far east. For Byzantium, however, the situation was far more complicated. What had begun as a plea for help had evolved into a Western movement the empire could no longer control. At times, Crusaders caused damage even to Byzantine territories as they advanced. This only amplified the deep mistrust between East and West. The Crusades were not merely a military undertaking, they were a massive migration in which religious motivations and economic interests merged. Knights sought glory, the poor hoped for a new life. Merchants encountered Eastern trade routes, kings and princes dreamed of new lands. These expeditions broadened Western Europe's economic and cultural horizons. Yet amid all this turmoil, the greatest impact of the Crusades was on the power of the Church. With millions of people mobilized by the call of the Pope, papal authority reached its peak. But this rise had a cost. The traces left by Crusader armies in the East made the gulf between Byzantium and the West permanent. Especially the sack of Constantinople that would occur in a later crusade, the Fourth Crusade, would destroy any remaining trust. After the First Crusade, Europe was no longer the old Europe. The East was no longer the old East. And the Church had, perhaps for the first time in history, placed itself at the center of a massive global movement. All these developments laid the foundation for Christianity's institutionalization throughout the Middle Ages, as both a political and cultural force. The Church was no longer merely a spiritual guide, but a colossal power capable of determining the fate of kings, mobilizing armies, and influencing entire continents. This power would pave the way for the next chapter of the medieval Christian world, the formation of institutional structures, and the rise of scholastic thought, which we will explore in the following section. After the Crusades, Europe had been completely transformed. While the tension between East and West continued to deepen, another transformation was taking place within the Western Christian world itself. The Church had now become the greatest power on the continent. It had grown wealthy economically, expanded its political influence, and culturally penetrated every aspect of society. During this period, Christianity reached its strongest institutional identity of the Middle Ages. The Church was no longer just a place of worship. It had become a center of law, an educational institution, a carrier of culture, and a political guide. Monasteries were at the heart of this transformation. The Benedictine monasteries, which had existed since the early period, formed the intellectual backbone of Europe through their disciplined work ethic, agricultural productivity, and their role in preserving handwritten manuscripts. Over time, new orders such as the Franciscans and the Dominicans emerged. The Franciscans preached poverty and simple living. They walked through the streets, giving sermons, directly reaching the public. The Dominicans, on the other hand, deepened theological education and became particularly effective in combating heresy. These two orders reshaped the spiritual fabric of Europe. As the Church grew, its administrative system also became more complex. To manage this complexity, canon law, the law of the Church, was developed. This legal system introduced regulations on everything from marriage to inheritance, from the conduct of clergy to the hierarchy of the Church. The Church was no longer just a spiritual guide. It had become an authority directing people's daily lives. During this period, another significant development took place: the rise of scholasticism. Scholastic thought was a philosophical approach that sought to unite faith and reason. The central question of the era was, can one reach God through reason? One of the strongest representatives of this movement was Anselm. The logical arguments he developed for the existence of God created a great impact across Europe. His successor and the pinnacle of scholasticism was Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas created an extraordinary synthesis by merging Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology. His works became foundational not only for the Middle Ages, but for all of Western thought. They were the main texts taught in universities. Yes, universities. The rise of the Church in the Middle Ages not only solidified its political power, but also gave birth to the key institutions of higher learning universities founded in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, became the intellectual centers of Europe. These institutions taught theology foremost, but also law, medicine, and philosophy. Knowledge acquired an organized structure for the first time. However, the Church's rise also brought some harsh practices. Strong measures were taken against movements considered heretical. It was in this context that the Inquisition emerged. The Inquisition was initially established to protect the religious unity of the Church. But over time, in some regions, it evolved into a repressive institution that instilled fear in society. Although its practices varied from era to era, the Inquisition became one of the most controversial institutions of the medieval Church. This powerful religious authority, which spread into every area of society, gave rise to a structure that shaped every stage of people's lives. From birth rituals to marriages, from agricultural production to commerce, every step was connected to religious rules. The Church was the central actor shaping the soul of Europe. All these developments also laid the foundation for a major cultural revival. Manuscripts were copied, philosophical debates increased, cities grew, and society gradually became more complex. Ancient texts preserved in monasteries were rediscovered, enriching intellectual life. This enrichment formed the seeds of what would later become the Renaissance. Even though the Church appeared to limit thought at times, it was actually the institution that created most of Europe's educational centers and thus prepared the foundation for cultural vibrancy. The medieval Church did not always carry a single face. Sometimes it appeared as a dark authority, at other times as an institution that educated and sustained society. This duality caused Christianity to leave behind a complex yet powerful legacy. And this long journey was now preparing Europe to gradually enter a new era. In the next phase, an age would begin in which thought was liberated, art was revived, and science rose to prominence. This era was the approaching footsteps of the Renaissance. Throughout the Middle Ages, the authority of the Church shaped Europe through crusades, monastic movements, and the rise of scholastic thought. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, this powerful structure slowly began to crack. The cracks weren't always visible at first, yet they could be felt across the continent. And through those cracks, a faint light began to emerge. The Renaissance. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth in Latin, represented not only a revival in art and science, but a transformation in the very spirit of Europe. Ancient Greek and Roman texts that had sat untouched on monastery shelves for centuries were rediscovered. The works of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero were once again read, copied, and analyzed in cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome. Wealthy families began supporting artists, philosophers, and scholars. At the center of this new intellectual movement stood the human being. Humanism placed value on human reason, will, and creativity. This was a profound shift away from the entirely God-centered worldview of the Middle Ages. Humanists didn't just preserve ancient texts, they reinterpreted them, embedding them into the foundations of modern European thought. In art, perspective, anatomy, and realism were rediscovered. Scientific curiosity turned toward understanding the workings of nature. figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael became not only great artists, but symbols of humanity's intellectual transformation. But the impact of the Renaissance extended far beyond art. One of the most transformative developments for Europe was the invention of the printing press. In the 1440s, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press changed humanity's relationship with knowledge. Where copying a single book once took months, hundreds of copies could now be produced in a short time. Book prices fell, literacy increased, and people began reading the Bible and philosophical works in their own languages. The printing press created a flow of information that the religious authorities could no longer fully control. This directly challenged the Church's centuries-long tradition of acting as the sole gatekeeper of knowledge. Europe was preparing for something new, not just a rebirth in art, but a transformation in consciousness. During this period, one of the first major figures to challenge the Church's doctrine was John Wycliffe. Wycliffe insisted that everyone should be able to read the Bible, and he translated it into English. This alone was a bold challenge to church authority, as only clergy were allowed to interpret Scripture. Wycliffe's followers, known as the Lollards, launched a significant movement in England. Though eventually suppressed, their ideas traveled far beyond England's borders. Soon after, Jan Hus emerged in Central Europe. Hus openly criticized corruption within the Church and argued that the Bible should be the ultimate authority. His teachings sparked a major social movement in Bohemia. For the Church, this was an unacceptable threat. In 1415, at the Council of Constance, Jan Hus was declared a heretic and burned at the stake. His execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The Church silenced Hus with flames, but it could not silence his ideas. His teachings would echo later in the writings of Martin Luther. During these centuries, Europe also faced devastating disasters. In 1347, the Black Death swept across the continent, wiping out nearly a third of its population. The plague deeply shook people's faith in the Church, because even priests could not stop the disease. Prayers and rituals seemed powerless. People began asking, if the Church cannot protect us, what does it truly represent? Such questions opened the door to slow but decisive change. Meanwhile, scientific and economic developments accelerated. The age of exploration expanded Europe's trade routes. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, Europe's global role shifted dramatically. The continent was no longer an isolated medieval society. It was becoming a rising global power. The Church, overshadowed by these changes, struggled to maintain its authority. Inside the institution, corruption, bribery, and the sale of indulgences grew increasingly common. Moral decline among clergy was widespread. This weakened the Church in the eyes of the people and intensified the desire for reform. Across Europe, individuals questioned whether the Church needed to change, or whether people needed to break away and find a new spiritual path. These debates, combined with Renaissance thought, became the spark that would soon ignite a massive upheaval. Europe no longer fit within the narrow boundaries of medieval scholasticism. Human creativity, scientific discovery, and the growing importance of the individual all eroded the Church's centuries-old dominance. And at this precise moment, in the early 16th century, a quiet monk would step forward, a man whose actions would reshape not only his own era, but the destiny of an entire continent. His pen held the power to transform the spiritual and political landscape of Europe. That man was Martin Luther. By the beginning of the 16th century, Europe was standing on the edge of a long accumulating unrest. The Church was wealthy, its influence was strong, but it had become hollow on the inside. People were now disturbed by the luxurious lives of the clergy, widespread corruption, and especially the sale of indulgences, the documents that claimed to forgive sins. The Church had turned its divine authority of forgiveness into a financial instrument. This practice created not only a moral crisis, but also a deep social one. Growing anger among the people was waiting for a spark. That spark appeared in a small university town in Germany, Wittenberg. There lived a young monk, Martin Luther, who was reading the Bible with intense devotion. The more Luther observed the Church's practices, the more he was shaken, realizing that these practices had no foundation in the sacred text. And one day, Luther's patience ran out. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses onto the door of the Wittenberg church. These theses were, in fact, simply an invitation to debate. Luther did not intend to split the church. But what he wrote would trigger something far greater. Luther said the church could not sell forgiveness. Moreover, he argued that salvation was possible only through faith. This idea directly targeted the authority the Catholic Church had built over centuries. Luther's ideas spread across Europe like a storm, with the power of the printing press. Within just a few years, thousands of people in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian lands embraced his teachings. During this process, Luther was summoned by Rome. He was asked to recant his ideas, but he refused. "My conscience is captive to the Word of God," he said. "Here I stand. I can do no other." These words soon became one of the most symbolic statements in European history. Luther was excommunicated. Then, under pressure from German princes, he was declared an outlaw. But Luther was not alone. Many German princes, tired of the Church's political power, supported him. This support would determine the destiny of the Reformation. While hiding for safety, Luther did something extremely important. He translated the Bible into German. This was a turning point in European history, because now ordinary people could read the sacred text in their own language, without depending on the interpretations of the clergy. The day the Bible reached the hands of the people, nothing in Europe would ever be the same. This is how Protestantism was born. After Luther, reformers like Zwingli in Switzerland and Calvin in Geneva emerged. These leaders didn't just establish a new religious understanding, they reshaped politics and society as well. The Church was splitting. Europe was entering a new era filled with religious debates, uprisings, wars, and fractures. This period would be known as the Age of Reformation. And this age was not merely a change in belief. It was a revolution that transformed Europe's politics, economy, culture, and intellectual world from the ground up.